It is really an incredible honor for me to introduce our weekend Shabbat scholar. Those on the education committee know that I gently encouraged us to consider her as a speaker for this weekend. Dr. Melissa Weininger is Assistant Professor of Jewish Studies at California State University in Northridge, which I hear that's Los Angeles, yeah? Her research focuses on Hebrew and Yiddish literature with an emphasis on contemporary Israeli literature. Her other research interests include gender, nationalism, and popular culture, with a particular interest in Israeli television. It's always nice when there's an academic who watches TV. I feel like I'm a cliche when I talk to Melissa, because I don't know any of the television she's watching, but it all sounds great. But her recently published book, Beyond the Land, Diaspora, Israeli Culture in the 21st Century, examines the meanings and uses of diaspora in contemporary Israeli literature and art. My personal favorite chapter in the book is about Israelis in Berlin. So hopefully you'll talk about it on Sunday. Wonderful. And with Shana Weiss, she also writes a newsletter on Israeli pop culture. It's called It's No Ibiza. Her work has recently appeared in the journal Studies in American Jewish Literature, as well as several edited volumes, including Applying Jewish Ethics Beyond the Rabbinic Tradition, the Routledge Handbook of Literary Translingualism, and, since 1948, Israeli Literature in the Making. When she's not busy writing, teaching, advocating, she is also an avid hiker and a triathlete, and a self-proclaimed lover of bad TV. I also want to add that I have known Dr. Weininger for well over 20 years. We were graduate students together at the University of Chicago. And the reason why I'm so excited to have to learn from her this weekend is that she was, it's not that I don't like people, but she was one of the few people I really wanted to see when I went to the library, because she was always in a good mood and was always reading something interesting compared to the rest of us. So without further ado, I welcome Dr.
Thank you to Ben for that lovely introduction. And actually, it's funny that he mentioned the library, because I have many fond memories of, going to the library and to the stacks to look for a book and finding Ben there. And then we would just talk for 2 hours, and then I would forget what I came in there for, and I would go home. So that's what graduate school is for. But I do have many fond memories of having these long conversations with Ben in the stacks at Regenstein Library in University of Chicago. So I guess we remember the same things. That must mean it's true. Okay. So tonight, just a little, because this is the first talk. I know that I've been brought here to talk about Israel in a way that is maybe a little different from the ways that Israel is being talked about in general now in popular discourse, and also in Jewish institutions and synagogues, and to talk about Israeli culture, which is really my area of expertise. And I plan to do that. I also plan to talk about some other elements of Jewish culture, especially tomorrow. But I also hope that what I'm talking about, and I've tried to convey this as much as I can offer us ways of thinking about topics that have become very difficult to think about and talk about within the Jewish community, especially in the last year, but even before that. And maybe give us different tools or vocabulary for thinking about these problems that seem intractable and are also, I think, have, divide many of us in a lot of ways. So, I'm not going to guarantee that I'm bringing everyone together, but you can decide after I'm done. So, this talk is to kick it off. I guess I see it as kind of an introduction. I've called it the New Hebrew, Contemporary Trends in Israeli Culture. And to be honest, I first gave this talk a couple of years ago, and I would say, and I still stand by everything I wrote in it and I'm going to talk about. But I would say I also think we're probably, and I don't know where this is going to go, on the cusp of some new trends that I haven't charted yet. And so just take that for what it's worth, or take that into account. So why did I call it the New Hebrew? That was not a typo, if you thought it was. I called it that because Israeli culture and society was built on this idea of the New Hebrew, really the New Hebrew man, which I will also discuss in a moment. And the New Hebrew was supposed to be this new type of Jew who was untainted by diaspora Jewish life, okay? And the New Hebrew because the Hebrew language and a whole new Hebrew culture was a part of this image of the kind of anti-diasporic Jew. But in the 21st century, which is where we are now, because of globalization, transnational cultural influences, and all kinds of changes in our world, contemporary Israeli culture now, of course, reflects not only this specific history of Hebrew and of Israel, but also many influences that challenge old paradigms, including this old image of the New Hebrew man, who was envisioned as Ashkenazi, white, male, and secular. Okay? So, and why? Why am I even talking about this? Well, I want to look at these kinds of trends that challenge this image as a way that this new Hebrew culture that I'm talking about might offer productive challenges to a Zionist ideology that has entrenched certain racial and gender hierarchies into Israeli life that I think are not unrelated to to many, or if not all, of the domestic conflicts within Israel today, which of course also impinge on Israel's standing position and interaction with the world. So, I'm really going to start from the beginning here. I'm first going to talk about what is Israel. I've thrown around a lot of terms. One of them is Israeli culture. It might seem self-evident what Israeli culture is, but I actually don't think it is. Is it the culture of Israel since 1948? Is it Jewish culture in Israel? Because, as we all know, Israel is not only Jewish. Who does this term, Israeli culture, include and exclude, and where does it come from? And to try to answer that question a little bit, to get into our topic, we're going to now back up a lot, all the way to the 19th century, specifically to 19th century Europe, where we would find, perhaps paradoxically, but not really, the origins of what's now Israeli culture. And that is the origins and development of Hebrew culture before the existence of Israel, and then its history as it became Israeli culture. And then I'll get to the major trends in contemporary Israeli culture and explain how they challenge some of those old paradigms. So let's start then with the origins of Israeli culture in European Hebrew culture, okay? Hebrew literature and culture originated in Europe. It was a European phenomenon, and it drew on both broader trends in European history and culture, and also European Jewish society. And Hebrew itself drew on historical layers of Hebrew, like biblical Hebrew, rabbinic Hebrew, medieval Hebrew, as well as Yiddish and other European vernacular languages. 19th century Europe, we have the rise of European nationalism, the birth of the idea of the nation state, something united by culture and language, and along with that, the rise of Jewish nationalism as a form of Jewish particularism in resistance to European anti-Semitism, as well as a Jewish desire for normalization, to be like other European nations. And if you read any of the work of the early Zionists, Herzl, Nordau, whoever, you will see this word normal, or abnormal, more often abnormal, because they were calling diaspora Jews abnormal, a lot. You will see the language of normalization a lot. The Hebrew language, as it developed in Europe, became a kind of metaphor for the renewal of Jewish national life, okay? And this kind of desire to be like Europeans. And now I'm going to direct us to the first text on the handout that I've prepared here to show you kind of an example of this from the work of the writer Peretz Smolenskin, who wrote about using Hebrew language in the diaspora as a form of nationalism, a form of diaspora nationalism, right? This wasn't a nationalism that longed for a nation state, but language as home. That's basically what he said. We have no monument, country, or name, and the only memory remaining to us from the destruction of the temple is the Hebrew language. We are secure if we hold fast to the ancient language which has accompanied us from country to country, to the tongue in which our poets and prophets spoke. Our language is our national fortress. Now, it's kind of a short jump from that idea to linking language with a political form of nationalism, namely Zionism. And early Zionists adopted Hebrew as the authentic language of world Jewry, over and against Yiddish and other diaspora languages. And they saw Hebrew as a way to build this new Jewish culture that was separate from and even in opposition to diaspora, Jewish diaspora culture. So as Zionists began to build Jewish settlements in Palestine, the idea of using Hebrew culture as a way of creating this entirely new Jewish identity took hold. And this is nowhere more evident than in the use of the word Hebrew to describe not just language, but also people, right? And this is where we get this idea of the new Hebrew. And our second text on this sheet is from Vladimir Jabotinsky, famous revisionist Zionist, who wrote, one starting point is to take the typical Žid of today, and he uses on purpose a derogatory term for Jew, right? Not an internal designation, right? Jew or Yid. And to imagine his diametrical opposite, because the Žid is ugly, sickly. We shall endow the ideal image of the Hebrew with masculine beauty. The Žid prefers to conceal his identity from strangers, and the other one ought to march forth with courage and dignity. Look the world straight in the eye and flaunt his banner. I am a Hebrew. So you can see here, just in this little quote, all of these ideas connected, right? About masculinity, about newness, a difference, opposition to the diaspora, and the sense that Hebrew itself enacts this transformation in some way. And that language of sickness and health, right, normal and abnormal, came together in this image of the new Hebrew or the new Jew, who was virile, masculine, tough, and healthy, always a man, as opposed to the diaspora Jew, who is weak, oppressed, studious, and unhealthy. The scholar Moti Regev has written about the development of early Hebrew culture in Palestine as a kind of nationalist practice. This is the third text. He writes, Zionism as a set of cultural practices evolved around two interrelated themes: the rejection of diaspora culture and the invention of a new Jew, the Israeli, or who would become the Israeli. From an early stage, the dominant cultural practices among Zionist settlers in Palestine were aimed at inventing a locally specific native Jewish culture different from traditional Galut Jewish cultures. Initially, in the formative period, this logic resulted in the successful invention and public imposition of a dominant cultural package known as Hebrew culture or Ivriut, Hebrewism. This image of the new Jew, as I mentioned before, was also very much male and European, Ashkenazi, and the exclusion of women and non-European Jews from the ideal of the new Jew, or the new Hebrew, also led to their exclusion from certain foundational aspects of Israeli culture, or their inclusion in this national culture building project. And the next two quotes I have on the page here are both about that, and I'm not going to read them out to you, but you can take a look at them. One is from scholar Naomi Seidman, who's written about the kind of consequences of masculinizing this image of the new Hebrew in a particular way. And the other is from the scholar of Mizrahi Jewry, Ella Shochat, and a very famous essay of hers that I highly recommend reading all of, called Sephardim in Israel, Zionism from the Standpoint of Its Jewish Victims, which is a kind of response or extension of a famous Edward Said essay. And these both address this exclusion of non-male, non-Ashkenazi people from the foundational image of who is Israeli. Okay? So that's the foundation here, that the origins of Hebrew language and culture, which are the basis for Israeli culture, have baked into them both a disdain for diaspora and diaspora Jewish cultures, as well as a healthy dose of misogyny and racism that is linked to that disdain. So for decades, this excluded women and non-Europeans, not to mention non-Jews, from inclusion in the Israeli canon. But as I mentioned earlier, fundamental changes in the way that our world operates, in the way that we consume information, and the way that art is created, and the way that we communicate, have begun to change that really fairly recently, right? Only in the last couple of decades. And so what follows is an analysis of certain trends that I identify. These are my categories, and you could always mix them up or make them slightly different, but this is how we're going to do it tonight. That I think challenge this foundation of Hebrew Israeli culture and that exclusion, and of women's voices, Mizrahim, Palestinians, and Jews and Israelis in the diaspora. Okay, so what I'm calling these four categories, and you can see them divided up on this handout. I have a few little things to look at for each of them, are what I call new voices and new forms, religious representation, Arabic Hebrew transculturalism, and then diaspora. And we're going to end on the diaspora. Why? Because we're in the diaspora, and it's important to us. It really is. And it's important for us to think about ourselves as diaspora Jews and what our relationship is. I think a lot of times we think of what is the American Jewish community, the diaspora Jewish community's relationship to Israel. But I think it's also important for us to think about what is the image of diaspora mean? How does it read in Israeli, in foundational kind of Israeli ideology and the way that that's expressed in culture? Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is what I call new voices and new forms. And what I mean by that is that in the last 10 or 15 years, voices that were previously marginal within Israeli culture have been pushing into the mainstream, or I shouldn't say that's passive, right? Marginalized people have been actively advocating to enter the mainstream. And these are the people and communities that are marginalized by this white Ashkenazi male image of the new Hebrew. And the first movement that I want to talk about in this vein is something called Ars Poetica, which is an artistic movement started by the Israeli poet Adi Kesar, and some other people, it's not just her, to showcase and uplift the voices of Mizrahi writers and artists. Now, Ars Poetica is a movement that's open to everyone, but focuses on Mizrahi artists. And what she began to do in, I guess, 2010s, maybe the late 2000s, is to organize something called a chafla. A chafla is an Arabic word for basically a party that often featured music and dance and food and all kinds of things. And these chaflot, which is already like a mixture of the Arabic and the Hebrew, it's the Arabic word with a Hebrew ending, which indicates it's kind of, the hybrid nature of the event. These chaflot were intended to showcase Mizrahi writers and other types of artists, musicians, spoken word artists, and things like that. I actually don't know if they still organize these or if they've been organized recently, but for many years she would organize these events, and it really helped to bring these Mizrahi writers into the mainstream Israeli culture. And Adi Kesar, there's a quote from here about how she characterizes the movement. It's guerrilla, it's an eruption, it's undefined, it sidesteps the gatekeepers, and the establishment does not know what to make of it. I have some other things she said about here, but move on so I don't talk for an hour and a half. And the other new voices, some of the other new voices that Ars Poetica has helped to bring into the mainstream are not just in literary voices, but also in other parts of popular culture. The next quote I have on the page here is from a song, actually, by and is very popular Israeli pop singer known as Stefan Lagar, and I encourage you to follow him on Instagram, where he posts a lot of stuff, and you can see his music and his videos, called Na'im Me'od, or Nice to Meet You. Stefan Lagar is an interesting figure. He's the son of Congolese diplomats who was raised in Israel, and received Israeli citizenship after serving in the IDF. So he really, in so many ways, as a black African man, does not conform at all, who's not Jewish, who's not conform at all to the image of the new Hebrew, but he very much sees himself as Israeli. He's a Hebrew speaker, he also speaks French and sings in French. And this is just a little line from a song that I think really illustrates kind of his position. Hi, what's happening, what's up, it's me, it's the goy, the other, the black national from Togo, from Congo, very much not from here, but when I accomplish something, I represent Israel. Again, if you go on YouTube and type his name in, you'll find all his videos. He makes great music, and he's a very interesting guy. And I encourage you to look him up. But again, we have this space that was made by movements like Ars Poetica allowed also people like Stéphane Lagarde to kind of come to the fore. And there are lots of examples of this. Another group of people that, another kind of population group that I see as challenging this image of the New Hebrew may seem paradoxical, but it is the immigrants and descendants of the immigrants who came from the former Soviet Union in the 1990s, who, while they were considered European and white, often were not seen as really Jewish. And there's a whole now generation of writers and artists who have created both Hebrew language and Russophone literature and art about this identity, about the difficulty of kind of moving into the Israeli mainstream. And I've just got a little excerpt here from the work of Arik Eber, who's very interesting. These are poems, but they're also kind of, you can also look for the video on YouTube. There's also kind of spoken word version of this video that's very funny and interesting if you want to take a look at it. I should say that normally when I give this talk, I have visuals, but it's Shabbos, so I can't, so I would show you the video, but if you come on Sunday, I'll show you video. At 8, cut right out from the Soviet Union and pasted into Israel. What could I do? I, a Russian boy in a religious school who was told that God rules. But just as I learned how and when to pray, my parents decided that God was not the way. First they say religious, then they say not. For God's sake, who am I, 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 what? You can see both from the kind of form of this and the content that it's not a traditional poem, right? And like I said, there's this kind of spoken word version within a video. And that's what I mean also by new forms. Many of these new voices also have come in as yet unseen or unheard of literary, musical formats. And that may sound kind of like, okay, well, you know, art is changing, art is developing. But it's actually very significant in the context of Israel, where there have always been very rigid standards for what constituted the Israeli canon and the Hebrew canon. That for decades and decades were controlled by a few literary journals and a few small circles of writers, mostly male writers, who controlled what was aesthetically and poetically acceptable. So to see these kinds of new forms is linked to the identities of these writers and artists who are just now coming into the mainstream and actively, as you can see, actively questioning both artistic and cultural norms in Israel. Okay, the second category that I want to talk about is religious representation. Now, this may not sound like it's a challenging category at all. I think we often think of religion as certain expressions of religious identity as regressive rather than progressive. But in the context of an Israel that was really built on the image of the secular New Hebrew, to have popular representations of religious communities, and when I say religious, I mean ultra-Orthodox primarily, also what we would call modern Orthodox, what's called a national religious in Israel, is actually quite challenging. And you'll note that I don't have very much text under this category, and that's because a lot of this representation has come in the form of television and film. Now, some of this you're probably familiar with, because these were shows that were popular in the United States as well. Probably the first television show, or the one that you might say say started this kind of trend was a 2008 show called Sugim, which was followed the lives of some 20-something national religious young people in Jerusalem and their kind of dating, their love lives and everything. And that may sound kind of like, okay, well, you know, that's like a normal TV show, but it was actually quite revolutionary because that kind of representation of religious people as normal, quote unquote normal, was actually unheard of before that time in Israel on television, right? And actually, one of the quotes that I have on the page here is from Yael Sharoni, who played one of the main characters, Ifat, and who, by the way, is also, I'm a Yael Sharoni stan, so she, I think, is probably the most brilliant Israeli actress working today. She's both a comic actress. For a long time, she was the only member of the cast of Hayudi Ba'im, which is an Israeli sketch comedy show. And she also has acted in these dramatic roles, and she is fantastic. But she herself is secular. She played this religious woman for the show. And she said, religious people, they were like untouchable, you know? Now you see that there are people like us. Our inner lives are similar. It was really incredible to reveal this. This is one of the things she feels she learned from working on this show. So you can see how revolutionary it was to have something like this on Israeli TV. And it paved the way for things like Shtisel, which probably everyone in this room knows about because it was on Netflix for a long time, which followed the lives of an ultra-Orthodox family in Jerusalem. And it followed their lives with sympathy and nuance, right? They were portrayed like other families. I mean, it's a very kind of soap opera-y show, but that even in itself, that the lives of this ultra-Orthodox family was depicted in this kind of mainstream genre was a very important example of the kind of entrance of this, you know, alternate image of who is Israeli into the mainstream. And now, I'll just name a few, but now there's tons of this on Israeli television. There's even a Haredi dating show on Israeli TV now. There's a reality show about Haredi women called Benot Barak. There are also, you know, what we now call, you know, it's like this kind of high culture, high concept shows, including one directed by Rama Burstein, who's a Haredi woman director who also makes great films, and a new one by an American Ola called Khanshi, that, as far as I know, is not available in the United States. Neither is the Burstein's show, but maybe soon. As well as the opening of a film school called Ma'aleh, which is a school for, what it's called, it labels itself a school for Judaism and modern life that's trained a lot of these directors who now work in film and television in Israel. So again, this really modifies the old image of the New Hebrew, right? And enriches it in a certain way to reflect the actual makeup of the Israeli population. Okay, the next trend I want to talk about is something that I call Arabic Hebrew transculturalism, and I would say there are two kind of branches of this. One represents the reclamation of Arab Jewish identity on the part of certain Mizrahi artists, okay? And Ars Poetica is also part of that. But there are other examples of this. For example, the musician Dudu Tassa, some years ago, discovered that his father and his uncle had been well-known, famous musicians in Iraq. Actually, maybe it was his grandfather or his great-uncle, now I can't remember, called the Al-Kuwaiti brothers. And he found some old tapes, like, you know, in his mother's boydom or whatever. And he decided to learn Iraqi Judeo-Arabic and re-record these songs. And he's released, I think, 2 albums of them now. One of my favorites that I've also included on this sheet is the rock band Iowa, which is a group of sisters of Yemenite heritage who sing pop songs in Yemeni Arabic. Some of them are modified Yemenite folk songs. And I also highly recommend going on YouTube and checking out their videos, which are very colorful. Their music is fantastic. It's a bop also, so, great pick-me-up. And just the chorus of one of their songs, which is really about the immigration of Yemenite Jews to Israel, and then their existence in transit camps when they were kind of promised, Zion, is on the page here. Where will I stake a home? In parentheses, you have a tent for now, or at least a small shack, along with 4 other families. Land of wheat and barley, grape and olive, fig and pomegranate, date and palm. So they really have, created this. It's a very particular, actually, Israeli expression of this Yemenite Jewish identity, but they insist on, their presence in the broader tent of Israeli culture. There's some more, even a very recent example of this is the writer Ayelet Sabari, who just released a novel called Songs for the Brokenhearted, which is about the songs of Yemenite Jewish women, and it's a sort of story about Yemenite immigration to Israel. She is an Israeli writer who writes in English, so it's also a translingual work. Highly recommend it. Also should get that if you can. And that sort of represents the Arab-Jewish part of this trend of Arabic Hebrew transculturalism. There's another aspect of this, and this branch of Arabic Hebrew transculturalism, I think, is undergoing now and will undergo in the near future tremendous changes, and that's because it is a Palestinian Hebrew culture. And there is Palestinian Hebrew culture. In fact, for many, many years, the most famous, most beloved, most popular writer in Israel, Hebrew writer in Israel, was a Palestinian man named Syed Kashua, who now lives in St. Louis or Indiana, thank you. He would do his PhD in St. Louis, and now he left. He had for many years a regular column in Haaretz, and he writes a lot about the fraught relationship that he has to the language. I've included a quote from one of his old essays from Haaretz in here, which actually, some of those essays are collected in a volume. And many of his works have been translated into English if you're interested in reading them. I think his best book is Second Person Singular, so that would be the one I recommend. So whom do I really write for? Does the fact that Hebrew and I chose each other automatically attest to a certain target audience? What does one write for Jews? Am I supposed to be a PR department for the affairs of Israel's Arab minority? Or am I supposed to be aggressive and threatening and make the target audience ashamed and want to change its ways? What does one write for Arabs? Expressions of condolences, words that will reinforce my sense of victimhood, or promises for a better future that's full of hope. He's very cognizant of the way that his presence within the field of Hebrew culture disrupts its trajectory, its history, its expectations, as you can see there. I've also included here a short quote from the Druze poet Salman Masalha, who also writes in Hebrew as well as Arabic, which you can read on your own. And the final category that I want to talk about here is diaspora. Of course, as I mentioned initially, Hebrew culture was really built in opposition to diaspora, right? Diaspora was not just excluded from it, but it was anathema to it, okay? almost denied by Hebrew culture. I mean, in fact, if you go into any Hebrew dictionary and you look up a word that has Yiddish etymology, it will not indicate, usually, the root of the word, okay? That's the way that diaspora life and language and culture has been excised from Israeli Hebrew. And there are a couple of kind of branches. One I'll talk about a lot more detail on Sunday, and that is the establishment of a movement for what's called diasporic Hebrew by a group of expatriate Israelis in Berlin. I'll discuss that at length on Sunday. There's just a short quote here from the writer Mati Shmuelov, who's one of the instigators of this movement, who writes about the creation of Hebrew culture in the diaspora as a specifically political act, okay? This reaction to close off borders, to deny Israeli diaspora, which is what he's talking about in this article, is reminiscent of the neoconservatism that we see in fundamentalist movements, which oppose globalization and freedom of information, and are explicitly against cosmopolitan identities. Is it even possible to create imaginary borders between Hebrew, Jewish, and Israeli works in the internet age? And that really is one of the questions that all of these trends raise for us. But what I want to talk about more tonight is the way that diaspora has been reconceived in a certain way within Israel, partly because of growing awareness of the importance of Jewish diaspora communities to Israel, but I think partly also because of some of this internal crumbling of the image of the new Hebrew and the new Jew as opposed to diaspora. And again, I'm going to play you a clip of this song on Sunday. That is my teaser for Sunday, the song Shake Your Boom Boom. You can go look it up again, but it's in my book, actually, too. But this is a song by the sadly late, lamented, broken up band of Static and Ben El, who themselves collaborated extensively with international artists, with global artists. In fact, right before the pandemic started, they were supposed to open on a tour for Pitbull, which was sadly canceled because, my God, that would have been a wonderful thing to see. Oh my goodness, okay, don't do that. But so they frequently touch on these kind of themes of globalization, of cultural transfer within their music. As you can see in the chorus of Shake Your Boom Boom, right? We communicate, no conversation, because your body talk, no translation, right? This idea of communication and absorption across cultures. The song is in English. They did it with will.i.am, so, you know, and of Black Eyed Peas fame. I'm getting a lot of blank looks, but okay, go Google it Aftershocks. And this has also been reflected in other ways in Israeli culture. Actually, just the other day, I saw an advertisement for a kind of a special episode of the show I'm going to talk to you about now, which came out a few years ago. I think it might have come out during the pandemic and been filmed right before. I think it came out in 2020. A show called The New Jew, which was an explicit play on this image of the new Hebrew. And it was hosted by the Israeli comedian and director Gur Kofi. And basically the premise of the show is he comes to the United States and he talks to a bunch of American Jews in a bunch of places to like show Israelis that there is Jewish life in the diaspora. And what it's like, it's really framed that way. It's like, oh my God, there's Jews here, and look, they do all these things that are so exotic and foreign. It's fascinating to watch as an American, because you're like, okay, calm down. He really, I mean, like, some of it's a little bit racist too, because, you know, he talks to some black Jews of color in New York, and he's just absolutely, like, you know, mystified by this, right? Because again, it's such a challenge to this image of the new Hebrew, right? And it is diaspora that enables that, right? That enables those multiple hybrid identities and that challenge to this Israeli notion of what a Jew is. But the quote I have here, and what I kind of want to end this section on, is a part of one of the episodes where he goes to visit this rabbi in Colorado, who's known as like the hiking rabbi or the mountain rabbi or something. And he goes up on one of these hikes with this rabbi on Shabbos, and they bring a Torah scroll, and he reads this bar mitzvah portion. And it's very emotional for him. Right? He's a secular Jew, so it's actually even already, he talks about how it's already strange that he actually read from the Torah for his bar mitzvah. It's not like a thing everybody does. And he says afterwards, it was an immediate bond. And this is something that is happening to me in the course of this, journey. He uses the word masah there, that I'm going through. I'm going back to what Judaism is for me. Because I'm always talking as an Israeli and talking to Jewish Americans, that is weird to me, all of it. And the thing is that it's doing something to me. It's turning me like inside out. And I want to leave us with that metaphor that is what these trends are doing to this old image, Zionist image of the new Hebrew, is turning them inside out. And these new artistic works and forms, as well as the inclusion of previously marginalized artists, challenges an Israeli culture fundamentally structured around a very particular Zionist vision of Israeli and Jewish identity. And I say that, and Jewish identity, because part of this is I also want us to caution ourselves against adopting this version of what Jewish identity is, Jewish diaspora identity is for ourselves. In a space where there is no longer much room for political dissent or resistance in Israel, in which autocratic tendencies by the government, as well as state-sponsored violence, have narrowed the spectrum of allowable political expression, artistic projects that offer alternatives to Zionist constructions of identity, even if not overtly political, have become one of the only streams of alternative expression or communication in Israel. And recognizing, acknowledging, and hearing these voices is essential if there's any chance of preserving a pluralistic society. Do I take questions?
Open it up first.
Okay, I see somebody in peach shirt, salmon shirt.
Around, but we might be able to just talk about it.
Okay. The other thing with Guri Alfi's show that we people in Baltimore should know is that the last episode he goes to Pearlstone.
Oh gosh, I don't remember every single part. He does? Okay. I don't know.
He talks about American environmental.
Oh wait, is that the farm?
Yes.
That's also a really interesting one because he goes, Jews who farm, like it's unheard of, like they're kibbutzim all over. It's like so weird. Anyway, yeah.
But anyway, what I was going to ask about is about what you were talking about at the end, the sort of political shift.
Yeah.
When I first spent time in Israel in the late 80s, early 90s, first Intifada, the top pop stars were singing songs that were very left-wing, pro-peace.
Or like Shlomo Artzi or something.
Crying.
Chava
Alberstein.
Right.
She turned Chad Gadya into
Yes, and she also recorded in Yiddish. Yeah.
Well, this was in Hebrew.
No, the Chad Gadya, but Chava Alberstein also records in Yiddish, which is also, kind of.
But more recently, it seems like there's been a real shift to the right that you see in the pop culture.
Yeah.
Especially we've seen this during the current war.
I was just talking about it. Yes.
Which was, anyway, I don't know if that's something you followed as well, but I thought that
yes, it's very complicated. Thank you for bringing that up. And I was just talking here about how, actually, Ben mentioned that I've written this newsletter about Israeli pop culture. And a collaborator and I haven't written anything in a year, about a year. We wrote something right after the war started. You can go look at it. It's about war memes, actually, like the war, right after it started in popular culture, on October 7th in pop culture. And yeah, I've been a little bit troubled, actually, by some of the, some of the shows that I like. Ertzne Deret has had some really difficult, like I think extremely racist sketches and things like that. And it does, I think it is part of what you're describing. And also, I also want to make a note about, like, for example, when I talk about religious representation, I also don't want anyone to think that that means it's like left-wing, that there's some like alternative kind of, loosey-goosey religious representation. I also think that in certain ways, that also represents a kind of rightward shift, even if it's challenging to these kind of fundamental cultural images. Because part of why that's happening is also because of a demographic shift in Israel, where the religious population has really increased and also their political power and visibility has increased, right? So not all of these shifts are left-wing either. Some of them are shifts also to the right, or they have moved to the right with the rest of the culture. So yeah, I think that's an interesting observation. I think it's correct. And I also think we don't quite know yet how it shakes out. Do you know what I mean? Completely. And actually my collaborator in my newsletter, Shana Weiss, actually this weekend, she's giving a talk on Haredi culture and political expression since October 7th. So like, people are looking at it and working on it, I think, or we will. But I think, again, time will tell what direction that takes,
Let's go to Daniel, and then I saw John Zenelman. I'll come to you.
So one of the things I notice often when you go into even Ashkenazi environments, Ashkenazi weddings in Israel, you're hearing Mizrahi music and everyone's dancing Mizrahi and being like, that feels like a very interesting switch. And also I want to plug for Arab Labor as an amazing show.
Arab Labor is great. Yeah. It's just like hard to get. So that's the problem. And that's the I know it was released on DVD a long time ago with English subtitles, but I don't even know if you can find it anymore. I haven't looked in a long time, which is too bad. I mean, that's the problem. And he has another show, a great show about kind of autobiographical, I can't remember the name of it. And actually, just last year, right before October 7th, he released a new kids show on Khan, which I'm writing about now, which is about a Hebrew-Arabic bicultural school, like the school his kids went to, a hand-in-hand school in Jerusalem. That's very interesting. Also interesting that it's a kids show. But yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to hijack your comment. But yes, Arab Labor, great show. Everything he does is really, brilliant.
So my question, I had like two questions. One on the side of, you mentioned about, maybe you'll get more into this tomorrow or the next day, about how understanding the other in Israeli society, where that's not being accepted, is of course a reason for a lot of the conflicts in Israel between Israeli society. And then the other piece that I think you're talking about something maybe is I'm curious about is the Israeli diaspora. Like, depending on what city you're in, like in Boston, we have the AIC, we have like an entire Israeli subculture that lives separate than the American Jewish culture. But in towns like smaller cities where you have Israelis in like maybe Baltimore or places where there's not a ton of Israelis, the Israelis seem to merge into the Jewish community more.
That's interesting, because in LA where I live, there's a huge Israeli, like so big that if you go to like Tarzana, those little like if you go somewhere, there's like a flyer with like, little advertisements and then like fake articles. You could find like 5 different ones of those in Hebrew in certain neighborhoods in LA, But at the same time, the Israelis also seem very integrated into, And admittedly, like, I haven't lived there that long, but just even for my students, I know who are Israeli or have Israeli parents or whatever. So it's interesting you say that. But yes, I will talk more about this question of Israeli diaspora in the US, but through culture. In other words, Hebrew literature in the US, and also Israelis writing in English who are in North America or not in North America. Some of them aren't, or were and aren't anymore. So we will get into that more, at least through a cultural lens. I don't know as much about the sociological part because I'm not a sociologist, but definitely I'll talk a lot about that. Yeah, so stay tuned, come back. Plug for my, yeah.
Over here.
Yeah.
By the way, there are even some Israelis in this very room.
Wait, what did you say?
There are even some Israelis.
Oh,
in
right.
this very
Oh my
room.
gosh, what a shock. I saw enough people nodding when I was talking about
It's false.
things that aren't available in English that I figured that out. Okay, yeah.
So, hi. So, one is, I want to ask you a question pre-October 7th.
Yeah.
Because I think after that, things change a
It
lot.
just muddled and it's hard
So
to
I
explain.
think one of the things that you're describing is this gradual and then more rapid integration of a whole bunch of external influences into the traditional Zionist narrative, which are changing the story. So on the other hand, we also saw pre-October 7th development of the nation-state law. Yeshiva is saying that we support Israel, Orthodox day schools here, including one which I went to in New York, saying on their webpage that we support a Jewish Israel, which was not part of it when I was in
Right.
school.
Right.
And things like, and really almost resist, and even from the standpoint of the government, for example, the ambassador who basically says, I'm going to rely more on Christian evangelicals than diaspora Jews.
Or the diaspora minister who like spat on those people, protesters in New York, yeah.
So the question is, how much of this is indigenous, or how much of this is a reaction?
Yes.
And I also, in the context of this, one of the things which I think may be worth mentioning is Netanyahu's father was Jabotinsky's secretary.
Yes, absolutely
So,
right. That is worth mentioning for sure. Also, the reason why Netanyahu grew up in the United States.
Yes.
Because his father was basically blackballed because he was a revisionist.
I went to Cornell undergrad.
Okay.
His father was there
Yeah.
when I was an undergrad.
Okay, guys, you brought up a lot of interesting things. So, in answer to your first kind of question, absolutely, this is what the trends that I'm describing are also part of broader trends, right, of globalization, and have to do with, and aren't just happening in Israel, in other words, right? I think in lots of places, even in the United States, I think we see this also. Technological trends, right? So for example, maybe artists who couldn't have had a platform before because they were so far outside the mainstream, now like can make TikTok videos, right? How many artists have been discovered, like singers and stuff, because they made a TikTok video, who never would have like been picked up by a major label otherwise, you know? So technological and global cultural trends, I think, definitely are a part of this, for sure. What was the second thing that you were talking about?
How much of the nationalistic, Carol will say I kind of drift off. How much of the nationalistic developments pre-October 7th was actually a reaction to this?
A reaction to what? A reaction to globalization? I don't know if I would say a reaction. I would say it's a symptom or a feature, right, of globalization. Some of this, in others, maybe it's a better way to say this, like globalization enables some of this. And you know, I guess you could see this as one of the positive features of globalization. Like maybe it allows you to see your own culture in a different way, or it presents certain challenges to a culture that you know was presented to you as monolithic, right? You see the cracks in the facade, or you're able to enter those cracks because you can make a TikTok video, or organize a gathering in Tel Aviv where your Mizrahi poet friends speak, right? And then people hear them. Okay, there's some. Oh, Zach has something, and Miriam.
I'm going to come to Zach next. So Miriam,
Okay.
and then I'll come over to Zach
Okay.
Burke.
I want to to where you started, and I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to the role of women in the establishment of the new Jew and the early pioneers, and the images of the women farming next to the men, the women fighters next to the men, and sort of how that fits into the trends that you're picking up here.
Okay, so a lot has been written about, or maybe a little has been written about this. I know David Beale wrote about it, but and that is what you're pointing to is a gap between theory and praxis. In theory, right, labor Zionism was an egalitarian movement, and women built the state, and also in theory there's universal conscription in Israel, and et cetera. In practice, women cooked the food and took care of the children and actually were expected to have multiple sexual partners because there were fewer of them than there were men, and to have lots of children with whomever was available. That was seen as their role in the Yishuv period and in the early settlements, usually. They were not egalitarian in practice. That was an image that was, and continues to be, promulgated then by, the Zionist leadership, and now certainly by the state, that has never really held true. I mean, look, it's not just Israel, right? Like, we all live in a patriarchal society, and that I think you're right that there was this image like Israel somehow more egalitarian than other modern societies, and that never was really true. I mean, you only need to look at like the number of women in the Knesset to show that, right? Which I don't even know what it is now, but it's not a lot. Did you ask something else? Oh, okay. Sorry.
So I wonder if you could speak about the changing role of translation. So like in translation, in literary culture, right? So in Europe, right, people would translate it into Hebrew to bring things into Hebrew culture. To show that Hebrew culture could be just as strong as whatever, or as French, whatever. But now it's about being interlingual, and there's so much, like, I don't know if you agree, but it's out of proportion to other countries. Like literary translation, at least what I know about it, like into Hebrew poetry, from like Yiddish, from English, from Spanish, like it's so much, right? And it's almost giving permission to people to cross those boundaries.
So actually, I'm going to take my answer in a little different direction, which is that in Israel, what you say about, so what Zach is referring to is that in the early years of Hebrew culture, like in the 19th century, Hebraists were one of the projects of the Hebraist movement was to translate European literature into Hebrew, right? To bring culture, world culture into Hebrew, right? So that Hebrew would be like every other language where it had translated works, right? But in Israel, the opposite is true. At least, maybe, not always, but certainly since with the rise of the commercialization of publishing, right? Being translated into English is essential if you are a writer. And in fact, the Sapir Prize, which is the premier Hebrew literary prize, carries with it a cash prize and a payment to a translator for a translation into English and the language of your choice. This is true in academia also, by the way. You really cannot get tenure at an Israeli university unless you have published in English. And part of that, I think, is just like a kind of practical issue. It's that there aren't a lot of Hebrew language readers. So if you are a novelist, right, you want to sell books, you need your book to be translated into English, where there are lots and lots of readers, and probably also like Spanish and whatever, French. Same with academia, right? That shows that you are part of a global, community of scholars instead of this very small, community in Israel. And I'm also, like, on this note, reminded that, although he's kind of quirky, and I think he did this sort of for political reasons too, the writer Edgar Keret, his memoir, the memoir that he wrote that was about his father's, like, it was like the last 7 years of his father's life and the first 7 years of his son's life, he published that in English translation before he did in Hebrew. And I actually think he said that was sort of for personal reasons, that it was like this very personal story, and he somehow needed to publish it at a distance from himself. But it was this very interesting phenomenon. Actually, when he won the Sapir Prize, the second language he chose to have, I can't remember which book it was, but the second language he chose to have translated into was Yiddish. And so, but yeah, so I think, and actually also just another note, and I'll talk more about this also on Sunday, but like the little snippet of music from Static and Ben El, I mean, they also sing in this kind of mishmash of languages, in English, Hebrew, in this song there's also like Spanish, and I think some, and Yiddish. Will.i.am calls them mishpucha. So yeah, it is sort of like this multilingual stew, and I do think part of that is just practical, like, there's, also in the early years of Israeli TV, there were only 2 channels. So what did people watch? They watched American TV, they watched South American telenovelas were extremely popular. Like, so many Israeli kids learned Spanish because they would come home from school and watch telenovelas. And these make appearances in other works. I mean, it comes up in other contexts in literature, right? This is just a kind of a truism about Israeli culture that it also, sort of had to borrow from all these other languages. And that too is interesting because I read you that quote from Moti Regev about Hebrew culture as being this kind of like foundational element of the nation, and part of that idea was that all Israeli culture was Hebrew, right? Hebrew culture and Israeli culture were synonymous. They were one-to-one equals, and there was nothing else. But you can see that that's never really been true, right? And so all of these other languages and this issue of translation that you bring up also challenges that idea, right, of this kind of monolithic Hebrew culture that is the only Israeli culture. It never was, and it still isn't.
I think we have time for 2 last questions. So let's see.
Oh my gosh, you guys have so many questions.
David, and then Donna will give you the last question. I'm waiting when you get into the diaspora discussion. I'm waiting for your exploration of the new show, The Desperate Housewives of Pikesville.
So I'll apologize if you've already said this and I missed it, but in what one thing that strikes me as sort of an interesting inversion is that in this country, multiculturalism and globalism are seen as threatening by the right and associated with the left.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm hearing is that in Israel, it's the reverse.
I wouldn't say the reverse. I would say the same terms don't necessarily apply. I mean, I think multiculturalism is also very much seen as threatening by the right in Israel. I don't think that's so much different. I mean,
well, but I guess what is striking me about what you're saying is that the challenge to the new Hebrew from multiple identities in Israel, including Haredi and Mizrahi, who are groups that I at least associate with the right in Israel, in politics.
Definitely like the Mizrahi population at large, yes, since the 1970s has been affiliated with, mostly with right-wing parties that have their own also right-wing parties. The cultural movements I'm describing are somewhat different. And in fact, some of them are explicitly left-wing. Like, I'll talk more about this on Sunday, but, and this was Ben's favorite chapter from my book, apparently, which is good. But the Israeli expatriates in Berlin creating this diasporic Hebrew culture, they're explicitly anti-Zionist. So they're very left-wing. And so that's why I say it's like, maybe it's just that it's like more mixed up. It's not one-to-one. Like, you can't say, oh, this is, right, parts of it probably are a threat to the right, and yet parts of it probably are embraced by the right. Although you can kind of see that happening in the United States too, right? I mean, even in this election, so many people were surprised that Latino men went for Trump, like 66% or something. So maybe we also need to think about, reevaluate those kinds of assumptions here as well. Maybe it's more complicated than we think, and you know, in both places, and probably it would do us all a service to think about that or think about why that is, right? Maybe we can come up with some kind of solution. But.
Okay, we have one final question over from Donna Kirschbaum.
Thanks. So I'm yet another heartbroken dual citizen, trying to reclaim a life here in the States. Or as I put it, after the third of our 4 elections in 5 years, lucky me, I'm a passport holder of not one, but 2 crumbling democracies.
Oh gosh.
That was,
I'm sorry,
several years ago. And one of the things, oddly enough, that makes me heartbroken is what I seem to see as a diminishment of irony and satire in Israeli life. Take, as you were saying, Eretz Nehederet.
Yeah.
Do you see it too?
I don't know if it's a you mean diminishment in that it's become kind of like cheap satire, not like sophisticated? Is that sort of what you're talking about?
Just satire in entertainment, in...
I mean, I think there definitely is still like satire. I think you're right in that. I think, and this is what I've sort of seen a change in October 7th. I don't have enough like data to characterize what the shift is, I guess. But you're right that there's some kind of shift or change. And again, like as in my earlier answer, I feel like probably we need more time to kind of see what that is. Because there's definitely still satirical representations and, you know, humor and all these things. But I agree there's some change in the way it's being deployed. And I wouldn't know exactly how to characterize that yet, you know?
What makes me heartbroken is that satire and irony used to be a weapon against authoritarianism.
Yes, right. And I think in that statement is probably the kernel of whatever the shift is. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And I would also be curious for us to observe the United States over the next few years and see what happens there too, you know. I mean, obviously a lot of these political trends are also global political trends, right? We're experiencing them now too.